So first, I want to start off by thanking all of you for attending today and introduce myself. My name is Carly Creighton. I am the head of Latin America here for Universum. Just to give you a brief background on myself, I have spent the early years of my career at Google, one of the top employers in much of Universum's research. My background, I have extensive experience in Latin America. I've lived abroad in Argentina and Mexico and Colombia and spent a good bit of time doing business development in those markets, understanding sort of the talent landscape and trying to build my own businesses there. And finally, I really value the power of data. So I've come from a place where data is incredibly critical in being able to make informed decisions. And many of the decisions I've faced as a business leader and many of the decisions that many of my clients have faced have been predominantly based in data and fact. And I find that having that level of information and insight really helps to inform a smart way forward and really good strategic planning. So my hope today is that I share with you some good data and some good insights that inspires you and sort of helps equip you to move along your journey as you consider Latin America one of your key markets. So, when you look at LATAM in a broader context, it certainly would be considered an emerging market. We've recently heard that 70% of GDP growth is expected to come from emerging markets in 2016. 70% is a tremendous amount of all the global GDP growth. And, to me, the implications as a business leader is that these are the places where the growth is going to be coming from many organizations. That means a lot of investment is going to be fueled into these emerging markets. And therefore, we're going to have to understand the talent in these markets as organizations and companies invest here. If you're a global organization, this is incredibly important as you're thinking about your expansion plan, who you're up against in these markets, where to go next, and who you will be bringing into the market. I think the days of, just bringing in your top talent from your local market and having them be expatriates for a couple years is sort of over. Talent is very scarce, and there's a high demand for understanding the local complexities of the market. So this is incredibly important as you think about your expansion. If you're a local company in Latin America, it's equally important, right? It's good to know where organizations that are global are thinking about going. It's good to know sort of where your market is headed. And I hope that some of the things that I shared today give you an insight sort of into the trends in the future and where we at Universum think the talent market is headed. So, why do we see so much growth in these emerging markets? Well, let's take a look back in order to understand where we are today. I think it's important to reflect back a little. And if we look at these macroeconomic trends, we can see that we're really moving in Latin American countries. We're moving away from a state of monopolies and high tariffs. So it wasn't until the 70s and early 80s where much of the trade borders were opened up in Latin America to a lot of the world. The historic ideas, this countries are reliant on the cash crop and simple industries. You take the Banana Republic as a prime example. Much of what was exported and what was used for trade was what was produced internally and very naturally in the organization. It's a very simple trade, and it wasn't until just a few years ago that some of the borders started opening, which drove a lot of foreign direct investment and growth in these markets. In the past, we've also seen a high level of political risk, and this has been a deterrent for organizations to expand into these markets. Another trend that we've seen is a brain drain to the United States and other developed nations. So talent was graduating from universities and considering to move abroad in a lot of cases to look for unique opportunities to find stable, secure jobs. And that has pulled a lot of the key talent out of Latin America historically, and we see sort of a shift in that trend that I'll touch on in a little bit. Finally, the IT revolution was late in coming, and we'll dig into this. But if you think about the early 80s in the US and Europe, you see a lot of personal computers and that kind of thing happening. Latin America was a bit of an anomaly in that sort of skipped a whole generation of technology and went straight to the smartphone and to the mobile phone. And And we see that mobile adoption in Latin America is actually quite a bit higher than anywhere else in the globe as a result. So these trends that have sort of been historically true and that we're seeing change is really helping diversify and make the Latin American marketplace more sophisticated, which is sort of priming it for its immersion. And we're really hopeful, given these just macro trends, of where we're headed. So one of these trends that will fuel this is really an increased investment in education. So you can see here on the screen that several Latin American countries are listed out, and you see that an increased investment is happening by governments in these countries on education. So this is looking at government expenditures on education as a percentage of overall GDP, and you see that across the board for 10 years between 2000 and 2010, an increase in this investment. So a very positive trend, which we expect is going to lead to an increase over time in educational attainment. So what we look at here is the percentage of population with a college or university degree. So you see the United States, for example, 40% of the population. You see a country like Russia where the expectation is that everyone goes to college at 60%. But then you see sort of Latin America sitting there in the middle. So it's fairly moderate, but with this surge of investment, we expect these numbers to increase. You can see Brazil on the far right. You see it's about 13%. If we go to this next slide and look at absolute numbers, you'll see that 13% actually represents a much bigger population. So we see here that Mexico and Brazil have the largest pools of educated workforce. So Brazil and Mexico, if you look at Mexico specifically, the number of 25 plus talent with a college or university degree is more than Colombia, Peru, Argentina, Chile, Costa Rica, and Panama all combined. So while there's growth in the region and there's a lot of hope in the investment that's being made here, we continue to see that the pool of talent still exists in the two largest economies in Latin America. We also see that in this slide, we see sort of a hopeful trend to come. So with a surge of investment in the educational system and with the hope of the technology revolution really making a wave in Latin America, we see a trend that we're waiting on, which is sort of employee productivity. And I'll highlight a couple examples here to sort of underscore the point. Peru on the far left, you see about a 4% increase of productivity per employee between 1992 and 2012. This was primarily due to the fact that historically Peru had done a lot of production and manufacturing by hand, and in recent years, by moving to machinery, have seen a really great increase in productivity per employee. On the other end of the spectrum, you see a country like Mexico, where they've had infrastructure, they've had technology, and you see slight adjustments and improvements over time, but not a significant investment to sort of beef up production. And then in the middle, we have countries like Brazil, Costa Rica, Colombia, even Argentina and Chile. And we definitely see an opportunity here for sort of an increase in infrastructure, an increase in technology, and quite frankly, sort of a change in mentality around work as the millennials sort of take over the workforce that has the potential to impact the productivity per employee. So with an increased investment in this space and then improved productivity per employee, we hope to see sort of progress across this region. But we know in speaking to clients and talking to companies that there is still scarcity. So while we're hopeful for a trend in the market that's going to drive a bigger pool and a more substantial base of talent, we know that there is still scarcity. And so we'll take Brazil as an example. In speaking to organizations in Brazil, a recent study by PricewaterhouseCoopers found that 57% of employers in Brazil have difficulty filling positions. And sort of that's on the cusp of Brazil, the expectation in Brazil to create 17 million new jobs over the next decade. So more jobs, scarce resources. We're sort of hoping for a surge in the talent market. But I think what we face today and what many of you on the call today are sort of struggling with or potentially facing as you think about these markets is what do we do today to attract and bring in the right talent in this fairly competitive landscape? So let's get in a little bit to what millennials, what does this talent market look like? What are they, what are their preferences? How are they communicating? What do they want? And let's better understand specifically in Latin America, what's unique about that market. So first, we'll just start with millennials generally and who they are. We have 2.3 billion millennials worldwide, and we see from a career standpoint a much higher turnover ratio for this talent. So twice the rate as older workers and an enormous surge over the next 20 years for this group. And many of you probably interact with millennials and have different perceptions and opinions. And we'll talk a little bit about who they are, but who they are specific to Latin America. So what do millennials expect from a good leader? Well, we did a study across regions just to understand better. This is very recent, actually. It's hot off the press. You're some of the first to see this data, and we're really excited about it. But we did a study to understand what millennials expect from a good leader across regions. And so in North America, one of the most important qualities of a manager is to not micromanage his or her team. So it's the third most important thing, and really there's a desire for autonomy in North America. We contrast against Central and Eastern Europe as well as APAC, and millennials expect their managers to be an expert in the field. In Latin America, however, they want their manager to be a role model. So having strong leadership and having role models and good management is something that varies based on market. And we've done research to understand sort of what that means. So in Latin America, they want their manager to be a role model. We also learned something about what they're afraid of. What do they fear? So while they expect a lot and they have high expectations, what is it that they're afraid of? And the two trends that stood out the most in Latin America is that Latin Americans fear that they won't realize their career goals. They won't end up in a place that helps them realize what they want to achieve in their career. And they're fearful of underperforming. So as a manager and as you think about sort of acquiring talent and nurturing talent, these are very important things to be considering for this demographic. They even think about diversity differently, right? So if we look here, you can see North America and Africa highlighted with this ethnic diversity component. It's really important to be ethnically diverse. Digging into Latin America, we definitely see here that cultural diversity is the number one most important. So again, what does diversity mean? Well, that very much depends on the region. And so it's important to highlight that gender and ethnic and age are much less relevant in Latin America than cultural diversity. So again, another important thing to notice, you're thinking about communicating out to the market what diversity is for your organization and what that means. So when we look then how they decide where they want to work, in our research, we assess, what are your preferences in a career, and what are your perceptions of various employers in the market? And we find that foreign firms, generally speaking, this is very much a generalization for the region, but foreign firms are considered especially prestigious as employers. So they do really well in our rankings. They rank among the highest achieving students at the top universities, rank foreign firms really high. We see 40% of Brazilian business and engineering students that they're really interested in international travel and relocation. So foreign firms give that opportunity for them. And that's definitely one specific profile, right? The internationalist, the person who wants to advance their career. But that is juxtaposed against another persona that exists in Latin America. And we see this much more prominent in countries, for example, like Mexico. The number one employer of choice for many Latin American markets is very often a state-owned organization like Pemex in Mexico, because it's a place of security and stability. So while these trends are general, we definitely see different profiles coming out given the state of the economy and sort of the experience and the preferences culturally of students across the board. And what we use to verify and validate that is this information here. So these are the top 10 employer attributes for business and undergrad students in Brazil. And this is just used as an example. But you'll see here, if we look at the things that are most important to Brazilian students, we have professional training and development, leaders who support my development, clear path for advancement, etc. And you'll see at the bottom, we have highlighted the one employer that is most associated with that attribute across each of these 10 attributes. And you'll notice that in bold, 7 of the 10 of them are global companies, are multinational companies. So there's definitely a strong preference for these organizations. In terms of how they're communicating and interacting, so how are Latinos interacting with brands, employer brands, in order to get information? And we see a really high preference for social media in Latin America. So many of you may be aware there's a high adoption of social media across the market. Just generally, Brazil and Mexico being some of the top markets for Facebook adoption, for example. But we see the percentage of undergrads who use various channels very much are preferring social networks to be their number one source. So they're using websites for sure, but you see here that in Brazil specifically, social networks are the number one as compared to a lot of other major markets across the globe. Very important to note as you're thinking about your strategy. So those are some of the big trends I want to highlight about the region generally, but as we all know, not every country is created equally. And I think it's important to note that when you're thinking as a global organization about possibly globalizing, meaning taking your global strategy and keeping it consistent, but also being relevant to the local market, it's really important to think about how you're adapting your strategy. So let me walk you through the slide that we're looking at now. You'll see on the far left, we're looking at the similarity of each market to Mexico in orange and the similarity of each market to Brazil in blue. And this is based on our research and the 40 attributes we use to measure what students value and what they are really looking for in a career. So naturally, you're going to see Brazil meet 100% Brazil and Mexico meet 100% with Mexico. A couple things that stood out to me as very interesting are things like India. So we see that India's similarity to Brazil is about 12%. So for me, if you're France or Italy in this case, France or India in this case, and I'm thinking about expanding into Brazil, I think it's important to consider how different my corporate culture, being a French company or an Indian company, could be from Brazil and the Brazilian market, and how much more important might it be that I adapt my strategy, etc. You contrast that against someone like Turkey and Brazil. Turkey has a higher correlation to Brazil, or Indonesia even, and Mexico, and there's a much higher similarity. So again, you're looking at about a 50% overlap between Mexico and Brazil, and we see an even stronger correlation between Brazil and the United States at around 60% versus Brazil and Mexico. So Brazilian students have preferences that are more similar to American students than Brazilian students are aligned with Mexican students. And I just highlight this as a piece of information that as you're thinking about expanding, it's important to consider where those preferences align. So a couple of other things that stand out specific to the Latin American market is internships. Internships and trainee programs in Brazil are certainly unique and very different than internship and trainee programs in any other market that I've come into contact with. They tend to be year-round engagements. They can go from 6 months to 2 years, and more similar to what in the United States we would call co-op arrangement. It's an ongoing sort of interaction with the organization. There's a lot of school by day, work by night, or work by day, school by night. And they're very heavily used as a way to lock in talent early. So we see that many employers that we work with in the market are investing heavily in their recruitment efforts around specifically their internship and trainee programs. And in the chart below, you can see that Brazilian undergrad students, the bottom is internship programs, the green is trainee programs, the blue is both, and the white is no preference. And this is interest in the market based on our research for Brazil in these internship and trainee programs. Across the board, we're seeing that 93% of undergraduates in Brazil are interested in these programs and actually relying on these programs for long-term career opportunities and a reference for their future career. A very important program if you're thinking about entering Brazil to consider as you do that. We also see some interesting trends around engineering students in Brazil. So most of the time when we do our research, we see that engineering students have very different preferences than business students. The market where those preferences are most closely aligned for us, even globally, is in Brazil. So we see Brazilian students that are engineers are very business-like in their career concerns. And what you're seeing here is just sort of a scatter plot, and you see the reason that we've shown this is that you will notice a line and a trend, and that is just to indicate the similarity in the preferences between the two groups. In fact, what we found in our research is that Brazilian engineers are more like US business students than US engineering students. So a very unique sort of forward thinking. They care about much different things than your typical engineer would. They're really looking for sort of career advancement opportunities and things of that nature. So a very important trend to consider as you're thinking about what talent to attract and perhaps even considering what engineering students might be able to do within your business organization. If we take a look at a trend in Mexico, we see a very big focus on entrepreneurship and creativity as a career goal. So you can see here that it's very important in Latin America generally, but Mexico is one of only 3 markets of our 40 plus markets that we survey globally where entrepreneurship and creativity are among the top 3 career goals for the organization. And I think that's particularly interesting as you think about where the economy is for Mexico and sort of where they are in this place. It's a huge opportunity to evaluate what does entrepreneurship mean for you? What is creativity? And how are you communicating that out to the marketplace? Taking a look at another market, Argentina, we see really favorable exchange rates. As many of you know, Argentina is experiencing a time of a bit of instability, and simultaneously, we know that there's a lot of talent located in Argentina. I spent a chunk of my career living down there and building a sales organization located in Buenos Aires, and much of what I found was that it was very easy to recruit talent in Argentina. They had a very great academic public education system. It was very affordable for Colombians and Mexicans and people from all over Central and South America to come down and get a great education and work their way through school. And so this is a really important trend as we think about exporting talent out of Argentina and into potentially other regions within the LATAM sort of space. So why does all this matter? You know, why do we sit here and give you all these trends? Well, as I said in the beginning, this is where the world is headed. This is where the global economy is headed. So I want to give you insight into this. But I also really strongly believe that with this data, you can have a really important impact in the short term and the long term. And so here's why. We've learned that using these insights to really build up your brand as an organization. And if you aren't familiar with Universum, I can give you a brief overview, but we help companies build their brand to attract the right talent. That's what we're in the business of doing. And we find that a very strong brand, really being intentional about what you're communicating to the talent market, does two things. One, it really impacts the short term. It allows you to fill those open positions. It really allows you to save and optimize your resources. And we see in the research and the reflection we've done with our clients globally, we work with many Fortune 100 companies globally, about a 50% savings per hire. So by allocating your resources in a really smart and intentional way, you're able to go to less schools or spend less money in programs that don't yield things and actually have more fruitful interactions and less expensive investments in each hire. There's also a significant long-term investment and long-term outcome as well. So as you think about building a brand for the future and just having the talent come to you and attracting, increasing your awareness and consideration, we also see an impact in the turnover rates, right? So if any of you have tried to address a turnover or retention issue in your organization, you know it's something that doesn't get fixed overnight. And by building a strong brand with our customers, we found 28% lower turnover rates as a result of having a strong brand. So my takeaway, my point in all of this is to say that using these insights to be thoughtful about how you're going into these markets, how you're building your brand, how you're communicating with the talent is going to have not only a short-term but a long-term implication for your business. And as I mentioned before, our vision at Universum is really founded in a desire to connect talent with the future. So our goal is to make sure that the right people get in the right organizations. And if you get the right people in the right companies, you have happier employees, you have happier moms and dads and brothers and sisters who go home from work. But as I mentioned before, you also get a much more effective and efficient program by getting the right people and the right talent. You save money and you have the talent you need to build the future of your organization. So in a nutshell, who we are, why are we even qualified to be talking about this? Well, I hope that many of you are familiar with us. For those of you who aren't, Universum is a company. We've been around over 25 years. We're a data-driven consultancy. So we do massive amounts of research across the globe in 40 plus markets. We'll be in 50 markets next year, and specifically are looking to expand in Latin America very extensively. So our 2015 docket is Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Peru, Costa Rica, and Panama. So we'll have 8 very specific markets across Latin America, and we're so excited for this growth in the region, for having even deeper insights into some of these new and emerging markets to be able to help inform you. Our research spans over 700,000 students globally, and we really have just a really rich insights, a really rich data set of insights into what talent wants in these markets and what matters so that you can equip yourself and prepare for your future growth. So just wanted to leave you with a final takeaway here. What implications does all this information have for employers, right? I've talked a little bit about how it could be beneficial to you. But I think there's several things that companies are faced with right now. There's the information avalanche. So candidates are in control. They know about employers. They have a lot of options. We see them being very picky about who they choose. And I think with the advent of technology and the advent of startups, things of that nature, options are just going to continue to expand. There's a free agent nation. So some see, employers as temporary and they don't see them as careers anymore. So how do we can't fight that. We can't change it, but how do we address that? And how do we cater to that in a cost-effective manner? Social media is challenging. It's hard to build engagement. It's one thing to have a lot of likes on your page. It's another thing to have a dialogue on your page. And the talent is telling us, especially in Latin America, they want to engage and dialogue with employers through social media. So how do we address that? And we have to be agile. Business goals change. There's growth. There's expansion. There's traction. There's all of these challenges, and we have to, as organizations, as a business leader and someone who's expanded into new markets, I completely empathize and relate to the challenges of needing to be agile and needing to stay flexible and nimble. And that's a very tough thing for lots of parts of the organization, but specifically within HR. So what are the ways that some of our key clients, and we see employers prioritizing, what are the things that they're doing in order to combat this? They're really focusing on differentiation. So how do they set themselves apart from the competition? How do they stand out and be different? I think that another big piece here is globalizing. So how do I stay consistent with my global brand, but localize who I am to be relevant to the local market? It's critical to build lifelong relationships. So if you're going on campus or if you're interacting with the talent, how is that continuing after you leave? What is the always on approach so that at 2:00 in the morning when they're hanging out with their roommates, they're hopping online and they're finding you? How are you building those relationships and those interactions both through pushing towards them and pulling them in towards you? Internal employer branding, it's great to go out to the talent market and talk about what you do, but what is true internally and how are you managing what's happening internally in order to prevent retention and turnover? And then strategic workforce planning. So really using talent as a competitive advantage. I mean, I think Google is an employer that's done a fantastic job of this. When you think back, 16 years ago when the company was founded, they built their brand on talent first. Their employer brand is what was built before their consumer brand. If you remember, many of you probably do, Google didn't advertise their products. They advertised who they were as an employer. And so everything was built around who they were as an employer. And that strategic workforce planning and really making talent their competitive advantage has set them up to do things like create cars without drivers, and to create sort of lunar fly to the moon projects. And so really thinking about how you can build your organization around your talent and have that be your competitive advantage is going to take your organization very far.
So I hope that you guys have found this to be really insightful and enlightening, and giving you really good perspective on the landscape. Many of you may be in the midst of 2015 planning and getting ready for what you have ahead. Maybe if you're an international company and you're looking to go global and grow in new markets, this is incredibly helpful to equip you. This is incredibly helpful to equip you in that if you are a local company.
If you are a local company, I think this can be very valuable to know where the landscape is changing and how it's evolving. And so, we, in the midst of your planning or wherever you are in your cycle, we would love to speak with you about this, and I'd love to share more. So there's two ways we can do that. If you have a representative you work with at Universum and you are in communication with someone in our organization, please do reach out to them to learn more about these markets and learn more about these trends and the work that we're doing there. If not, we'll be following up with you directly following this session so that we can connect with you and answer any follow-up questions that you may have. So we'd love to chat with you. Thank you for your time and your attention. And now we'd love to open it up in the last 15 minutes here for questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Kat Lynn, who's our head of marketing, to sort of lead that initiative.
All right, great. Thanks, Carly. So for anyone on the line, you can enter questions into the questions tab on your control panel. And then one that we've gotten kind of throughout the webinar is if the slides and the recording will be distributed. So yes, that's a really quick, easy answer. We'll be sending this out to anyone who's on the line. So you can expect those recordings. Another question we got is, how should we differentiate our company within different countries in Latin America?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Thanks, Kat. As I mentioned throughout, I think one of the big challenges is how do you scale and be relevant at the same time? And I think, for me, as I mentioned, I believe in the power of data and having an understanding of
where the similarities and differences are across the region and figuring out exactly where you need to scale. But staying consistent as an organization and staying consistent to your brand is incredibly important on a global scale, and then understanding the local trends and figuring out sort of where are the biggest outliers and how do you adapt. So it's a challenge. I think every global organization faces it. But I guess the one thing that I can say with certainty is if you don't adapt, it's very hard to be successful. McDonald's once tried the "I'm Loving It" campaign and expanded it globally into every market, and they thought, oh, well, we'll save money by having one campaign that we do globally. And it did save a lot of upfront money, but it cost them millions and millions of dollars ultimately because they were unable to reach their target audience. So we got to find the balance, but we're happy to, if you have that challenge, happy to chat with you further about it.
Okay, great. Another question, I guess, kind of in a similar vein, how can we build a strong culture between locals and expats?
That's such a great question. And culture is such a big piece of employer branding. You know, having a really good pulse on what's going on internally within your organization is key. And, you know, I think culture is something that's built really organically. It's built through demonstrating through leadership, but that happens at all levels in the organization. So I think a lot of companies face this in different ways, and they address it in different ways. But you know, really having a good understanding of what the internal culture is in your organization. So taking the time to understand your organization, what they care about, what they value, and understanding where the gaps are within your organization and putting programs in place in order to address them. Great question.
Okay, great. Another one is, how would you recommend addressing the desire of global LATAM and for all emerging market candidates to stay in developed markets rather than come back home to their home economies?
So their desire to stay versus to come back to their home economies. You know, it's a tricky one. I think there's a lot of forgive me for saying this, but a bit of sex appeal of going abroad, and it just depends on where you are in your career. I know that really early in my career, I was very eager to be abroad and live abroad and travel all the time. And I'm in a different personal season of life where being home is quite attractive and appealing. So I think it's really getting a really good read on your workforce and understanding preferences and interests of your talent, and then knowing what it is that drew them there originally, right? So it is a pretty overarching challenge, but I think knowing what's available in your local market and then workforce planning around that can be a very valuable way to plan for the future as your talent sort of moves across borders.
Okay, great. And another question, I guess, sort of a similar vein, would it be better to have an in-market presence or hire talent from the emerging markets into the global offices?
Yeah, also a really big challenge, and something that, you know, we even face as an organization ourselves. We have part of our team that works for the Americas located in Brazil and in Latin America, and we have part of our team that's supporting Mexico and some of our other emerging markets located here in the US. I mean, there's definitely a lot of variables to consider. There's language, there's cultural preferences. So in Latin America, there's a strong preference for face-to-face. You have to think about the business, what it is that you're doing in the market. So if you're selling things that are hard to communicate over the phone versus in person, you have to think about the complexities of your product set. And then you have to think about some of the bigger business things, like what the cost of setting up entities and business units and things. And I'm not an attorney and I'm not an accountant, so I won't speak with much authority on that, but I know that it can get quite complicated. So I would definitely recommend thinking through some of those bigger picture things before making that decision. But, you know, it depends on how you want to define your culture. And I think for us, we try to find the balance, but it just is going to vary based on business. It's a great question. Any other questions, feel free to type them in. We'll hang on here for a couple more minutes and while we wait for those to come in. As Kat mentioned, we will send out the recording to those of you who attended. Thank you for your attention. I hope that this is a slice of insight for you. And I know that it is a broad landscape and a really exciting space to be working in, but it comes with a lot of challenges. And we're certainly here to help equip you with the knowledge and the insights to, go with confidence into these markets and really build up your presence there. All right. Sounds good. Well, thanks again for attending, and we'll be following up with you after the session. Everyone, have a great Wednesday.